The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar podcast. Jack Benyon here. Got JR Hildebrand alongside me. One of the few occasions we were actually in person at a track together over the course of the weekend. It was nice to catch up, and we also got to meet IndyCar memes as well while we were together, so that was pretty cool. Won't reveal any details
highlight of my weekend.
Yeah,
no question about it.
Won't reveal any of their details, but we had a great time having a quick chat with them, didn't we? And yeah, that page is pretty awesome. So I guess we'll get straight into Long Beach. It's a busy weekend. We'll break down Scott Dixon's incredible victory that has captured imagination around the kind of motorsport world a little bit, which is nice to see. People kind of sitting up and taking notice a bit more than perhaps they maybe usually do, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. We'll also talk about Theo Pourchaire's pretty incredible debut, I think it's fair to say, Arrow McLaren, and we'll get into a little bit of Josef Newgarden's race and his incident with Colton Herta towards the end there as well, which is another kind of key factor in how the race played out. So I think, JR, we'll start with Scott Dixon. There's not really any other place to start this conversation or chat about the Long Beach race without talking about him. Before we get into any kind of detail about his race, I guess we should sort of explain what happened and how he ended up winning the race from 8th on the grid. So we had a caution around 15 laps in, and Dixon was not even the first person to gamble on that strategy. It was actually Will Power who dived to the pits under that first caution, and it basically meant that those guys would try to make the end of the race on one more stop while everybody else would need 2 pit stops. So the people who needed to make 2 pit stops could work their tyres a bit harder and use a bit more fuel, whereas Will Power and then Scott Dixon shortly after, who overtook Will Power quite soon after that caution, had to do a lot more saving. obviously at the end we were expecting a big fight between Scott Dixon and Josef Newgarden. That's exactly what we got. But an incident with Josef Newgarden and Colton Herta kind of slowed Josef down. Colton wasn't able to kind of make the challenge either. So Scott Dixon held on for the win. So I guess, Joe, I want to start with a little bit of kind of what I asked Scott about in the press conference after the race, and that was that you've got, well, let's just like kind of distill this down to the kind of basic fundamentals of how these guys go racing. So you've got 27 people on the track, and I imagine all of them believe that they can win an IndyCar race. They believe they can set the fastest lap in a race. They believe they can compete for pole positions and podiums. They feel like they're on an even and level playing field, and it'd be very rare that you would get to the end of an IndyCar weekend where any driver thought, if circumstances were a little bit different, I would have been able to win that race and I would have had the ability to do it. But I just found it really telling that at the end of the race, Alex Palou, who obviously crushed all opposition last year, just kind of went, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do that. Like that was not in my wheelhouse to do what Scott Dixon just did. Obviously paraphrasing slightly, but he did flat out say that he just wouldn't have been able to do it on multiple occasions, and did so again in the post-race press conference. So when I asked Scott about this, what it felt like to have someone as well regarded as Alex Palou say something like that, Scott also kind of brought up the fact that Palou also has access to all of his data and can see how Scott's car's set up and how he's driving it over the course of a race. Maybe not like, obviously in the race he can't see how that's all playing out, but we've seen Scott Dixon do this on multiple occasions where he's been able to do all this kind of fuel saving stuff. So Alex has got plenty of data of like how Scott has gone about this, and yet is still seemingly incapable of even attempting to do this. So I guess, what do you think that feels like as a driver to in pretty much every area that you go into an IndyCar race, you probably feel like you're on a relatively even playing field in terms of that you can achieve all of the things that any of the other drivers can achieve. But in this area, that's not really the case, is it? Because Scott is a kind of class above everybody else here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're Scott Dixon, if you're asking me how I think I'm feeling if I'm Scott Dixon, I'm feeling like I'm the fucking man. And
but how's everybody else feeling?
Yeah, everybody else is feeling pretty I guess to your point, it's just so rare that you end up in these situations that somebody else is doing something that motorsports is an interesting place right now, because sometimes races are won like this where it's just not quite so obvious exactly what's going on from the outside that makes it so exceptional. But then so it sort of takes quotes like that from a competitor, probably even for us, to really appreciate, like Alex he's not just, that's not a handout in terms of compliments and it's the type of thing that I've had other drivers. I brought this up on the pod last year or 2 years ago or something, that I had another driver just unsolicited say something similar about Alex Palou. And it makes you, it sort of, even for me as a I've been a competitor against all of these guys at various points, and obviously for my entire IndyCar career, any IndyCar race that I've ever been in, Scott's been a competitor of mine, right? That it still hits a little different when you hear it from an active current competitor, that they're doing something that they're just they've decided just of themselves that they can't get over it, like that there's something here that they just can't do, and they've sort of resigned themselves, was the word I was looking for, to the fact that like maybe this is just something that this one guy is just better than me at, and there's not. I mean, we've had this conversation. It was actually a brief conversation on Twitter recently about whether the idea that sort of broadly about the role that data analysis plays in motorsport these days. And this comes up a lot in the context or kind of reminiscing about a time when, we didn't have data, we didn't have so much data. And so it wasn't really as easy. You didn't have all this sharing of information. And so you think, I don't know, back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, where it was just kind of like driving by the seat of your pants. And it was basically all just down to raw talent. And maybe you'd stand at a corner and watch another guy go by and see if you could figure something out, or you'd follow him around for a lap or whatever, but you couldn't really see explicitly what somebody else is doing. and I think there's sort of an engineer's mindset to the idea that it's a specific talent today to be able to look at somebody else's data and actually go replicate whatever it is they're doing, because it's just so commonplace that you have access to somebody's information that's faster than you. And in the context of IndyCar and a lot of other championships, there is some data that goes around on purpose, like not because somebody's stealing it or something, that you have access to the fastest guy's lap time from a different team, even, so there's really an abundance of information that you have to go off of as a driver and team to kind of at least to work out where are we fast and slow compared to somebody else. So what are some obvious areas that we can go work on? It's then up to you as a group to like kind of work out or problem solve from that basic information. Like, okay, how much of this is driver? How much of this is car? Whatever. How are we going to actually address that? But when you're talking about two guys inside the same team, like we're talking about here, two A plus, dudes, drivers that have great teams, that have great engineers. They've got, there's no better. You could throw some other guys into this mix, but really you'd have a hard time coming up with a better 1-2 punch than Alex and Scott within the same organization with the teams that they have, the groups of people that they have surrounding them on those entries. Man, it's Scott did this a few times last year and, reminded everybody that he can still do this kind of stuff. This was frankly, in my mind, like much more apples to apples against a bunch of other drivers trying to do the same thing that just couldn't do it. Honda probably plays a role in that. When you get in these kind of fuel saving situations, you got to factor in a little bit of, all right, there are some differences in terms of, what different guys kind of have to work with, maybe in terms of their tools, which probably is where, it's where the comments from Alex Palou really come from, is that he's working with all the same stuff. Will Power maybe in the back of his mind is sitting here like, well, maybe the Honda was just getting a little bit, whether it was or not, you at least you have a little bit of like plausible deniability that it wasn't all just on you. You didn't just completely just get beat like, man to man. But man, it's it definitely is. It's a humbling experience, I guess, is probably how a lot of other drivers are feeling. Humbled is the word that I would use when you see Scott go out and do this, because he makes no mistakes. And because all it was going to take when Josef was there behind him, and I thought it was interesting listening to Josef afterwards. And I thought this watching it as we were watching the race kind of get into the closing stages. He certainly did not think it was going to be a gimme to get by Scott. Like, it wasn't like he was biding his time and then kind of got shuffled back and just wasn't in the hunt at that point. I think he was probably sitting there like, oof, like I thought this would be easier, and probably put a lot of effort into it, while he for sure did have like a significant tire advantage when he first caught up to Scott. And it didn't even really look like they followed his onboard a lot. Didn't look like at any point he was really within striking distance. Like, I don't think there's a straightaway corner braking zone, whatever. I don't think there's a particular moment there that Josef is thinking like, oh, damn it, like I should have just stuffed it in there or something. Like that opportunity it wasn't evident to me watching it that opportunity ever really even materialized or presented itself. And so, Scott, I think that the other thing that we talked about when he won the Indy GP last year or it was either Indy GP or when we talked about his gateway win, is like, are these guys, there's a few of the things, like, I think they were more trimmed than a number of other cars in the field. That's going to help you with your fuel mileage. It's going to help you with your, avoidance of getting, kind of your just built-in defense against getting past. A couple of holes of rear wing or whatever, like, do make a pretty significant difference at Long Beach, in terms of creating a gap basically between the last corner and the start finish flag stand. Even you don't think about that as, the car is not yet at like terminal velocity at that point, but a little difference in trim will let you just break away and kind of break the toe a little bit out of the last corner, which makes it so that a guy even on push to pass is really having to hunt you down, going into turn one, regardless of how close they are into the last corner. So there's a few of those things that kind of made me wonder, like, are these guys just playing 4D chess, when everybody else is kind of not in the same range of strategy? It at least opens the door for that question to be asked. Like, were they hedging their bets on gambling on this kind of strategy before the race even started, basically? Or were they just thinking, we think Scott's as good or better as anybody at taking care of tires, and so this will just help regardless? But you kind of, when you see teams that really do get into stride and really do know what their strengths are, and they really trust and believe in the strengths of the driver, those are all components to things like this happening. And so I think we saw this at the tail end of last year. We're seeing it here again, that the team also is enabling Scott to really be the best version of himself, to go do these things that maybe nobody else can do, because they have like an ultimate belief that he still is that guy and he can still go do these things, which is pretty awesome.
He said that he usually questions these calls, but in this case, he didn't even raise a question. He just pitted when they told him to. And he also said that the call to pit came quite late, which he thought was maybe the team trying to hide the strategy a bit in case basically everyone followed him in and tried to do the same thing. And I guess what we've seen with a few of these fuel saving strategies is you kind of touched on it with the Honda point, that it's rare that we see two kind of equal drivers, like both with the same engine, going for this kind of strategy and like sticking to it. Like, you quite often maybe get a Honda will do it and then bail out of it and not really see it through to the end. But I mean, I'm not saying that Scott's not going to win anyway, but we don't usually quite get that comparison between two of the same manufacturers, which is kind of what you were alluding to with Will Power as well, and him being kind of taken out. Almost like the gap between Dixon and Power was like 8 or 9 seconds by the time they got to their pit stop, having Dixon started behind Power after those pit stops. So pretty wild unfolding chain of events there. There's a couple of things I kind of wanted to add in around that, and I guess Honda have brought an updated part for some of their cars for this weekend, which seemed to help because Chevrolet seemed to have their number at St. Pete, and here in Long Beach it was at least a little bit more even, with Felix Rosenqvist taking pole, and also with a Honda kind of sweep of the podium. How much you build into that Josef should have been on the podium is obviously an aside to that, but at least looks like the kind of scary kind of hold Chevrolet appeared to have over St. Pete looks to have evened out at least a little bit. But we do know that St. Pete and Long Beach is like comparing apples and oranges, so we definitely need some more data going through the season to get a little bit of a better idea about that. There's some other elements of Dixon's win that I thought we should point out. I think the thing that excited me a little bit was that so often where we get these fuel-saving races, you get a string of cars that can't use push-to-pass, but it was clear that Scott was at least decent enough on the fuel that he wasn't scared to use it. And I think that kind of builds into the point you were talking about off the last corner. He was just using like a second or two almost every lap when Josef was behind him, and it was just he had obviously had a lot more push to pass than Josef did. He couldn't use it all because of obviously he was still trying to save fuel at the same time. But I thought that was an interesting aspect, that it's quite rare in IndyCar that we get a driver trying to save so much fuel over the course of a race and also being able to use push to pass even if it's just at one corner. Like, that felt like such a crucial part to Dixon's defense in that case as well. So those were another couple of other kind of aspects of the win I wanted to mention. You can go to the-race.com and read a bit more of an in-depth feature on Scott Dixon's win. I talked a little bit there about how he's kind of interpreted by people, because I guess the fact that he's just not flashy in the sense that he's not really flashy in how he goes about his racing. Like, he's rarely on pole. Quite a lot of these wins come from strategy and him obviously being amazingly fast in races to make these strategies work, but they're just not like the kind of fast hands sideways stuff we get out of some of the younger drivers in the series. It doesn't always look as spectacular, but when he pulls off a race like this, it's about as spectacular as it gets, because as we've already discussed, people can't match it and can't do the same thing. JR, I know you follow so many different championships as well as IndyCar, from anything from MotoGP and Formula One and all these other championships, and to me at least, having covered lots of different championships myself as well, it does feel like Dixon doesn't always get the praise he deserves for what he's able to achieve. But it is nice when he pulls off a performance like this, because it's not really anywhere for anyone to hide in this circumstance. It's nice just to, I guess maybe it's kind of like a poorly kept secret in terms of IndyCar. Everyone knows how good he is, and anyone will range from putting him into the top 3 IndyCar drivers of all time to maybe calling him the best of all time. Obviously outside of IndyCar, it's probably a little bit harder if you don't follow the series to kind of work out where and why he's so good. But I definitely feel like these wins are going to be more and more important to just establishing that kind of legacy that we all kind of know that maybe isn't quite as widespread as it probably should be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's, even this conversation has become a part of, why a number of us are sort of, really starting to push for new chassis, new engine regs, these kinds of things. Like, we've gone through this period of, okay, like we have to, IndyCar kind of had to get its act together or whatever, coming out of the split and, all of this stuff. But we've been doing the same thing for so long now that these kinds of performances, you just get kind of lost in the mix. Or what Scott Dixon has done over the last decade starts to feel a little bit like, okay, is this just the same thing like over and over again? Like, what's, what should we be picking out of this?
Yeah.
Kind of, it's not, and to your point, it's not, IndyCar is, we'll talk about Theo and his like reaction to being an IndyCar, which is the same as any race car driver's first reaction to being an IndyCar, which is like, this is awesome racing and it's pure and raw and physical and all of these things. But that still doesn't translate enough through the TV, or it's not so excessive, any of those things, that besides the closeness of the racing, like that I think is fairly apparent when you watch an IndyCar race compared to other stuff. But
yeah,
all of those other things kind of fall a little flat by the time you're watching it from afar. As soon as you're removed from the actual driver's seat, those things are like less obvious that they're going on. And so, I bring that up just to say that it's almost one of these things that, like, I'm a firm believer that if some of those things were just more obvious, like we're just more blatantly clear that this is super hard to do and very differentiated in terms of just the difficulty factor of doing this compared to any other circuit racing that there is, because I think broadly there are elements of it that make it as such, even just in its current state, that you would just have a greater natural appreciation for what Scott Dixon does, because him doing what separated him here in this event would be even more blatantly obvious when everybody else is really hanging on for dear life, trying to keep tires working to the end of the race and managing 1,200 horsepower or whatever. You'd have Scott Dixon just Jim Clark style, with this thing on like the ragged edge, but so elegantly clean through every corner, managing the tire wear, dealing with the fact that he's a little more trimmed than everybody else. I mean, those are all the things that he is doing that made it so that Alex Palou is like, I just can't do that. Like, that wasn't going to be me today. And so, yeah, I think it's on both sides of it. It's great for these things to happen where he does get this recognition. When you look at the stats starting halfway through the year last year to now, it's one of those things. If you had like a rolling championship rather than a calendar year championship, we'd be having a different conversation about even last year probably. Or about exactly how dominant Alex Palou was last year, because Scott basically had his number in part through weird situations like this, but doing the things that only Scott can do. in terms of being able to sort of answer the bell here. But the flip side of that is you always have to just, as somebody who does know those things about Scott from being a competitor against him, from seeing the things that he's done, even just at Indianapolis over the years, let alone on like a weekend to weekend basis. I definitely do take, I take a moment of pause to appreciate that he's being appreciated, I guess, because it feels like something at this point that is so broadly recognized within the larger industry of motorsport, basically. But just unfortunately not that far beyond that, basically. And I'd say that for all of these guys, for Josef, for Scott, for any of the guys that have kind of been here doing this kind of thing day in and day out, Will Power, whatever. I think if as a silly but I think probably accurate analog, if you had just stuck any of those guys in a Red Bull car starting 10 years ago and just left them there, like let them be, if you could rewrite history and say any of these, there's 5 or 6 guys probably that have been in the IndyCar championship for about that long, that if you'd have given them the same opportunity locked into a tier 1 ride in F1, they'd be doing the types of things that those elite guys in F1 are constantly getting recognized for, just on a results basis, basically. So it's I think it's also just a reminder that the Long Beach Grand Prix still has a lot of resonant value to people. Like, I think part of why he's getting the props that he's getting more broadly here is just because it's Long Beach, and I at least don't think that's a totally insignificant component to it.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with cash back match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Well, to add to one of your points there, it's Dixon's going to finish his career having done more than half of it in this car. So, I kind of, when you think about things in wider terms, that's a quite incredible stat to have done over half your career in one car. And I totally get your point about that. It's a really good one. But yeah, I mean, what is there left to say about that performance? Really, I think the only other thing to say is that I think obviously the fuel saving is such a big aspect of how he won that race and how he's won 3 or 4 races in the past, few years. But I think for me, it's just so important to recognise that that's just such a small part of his race wins. Like, I wouldn't like to try and describe how difficult it would be to keep Josef Newgarden behind you if he was on the same set of tyres with the same amount of fuel and the same car. Like, that sounds like a battle that a lot of people are going to lose. To do it while you're saving fuel on much older tyres, having spent your whole race kind of just saving everything you've got for that final kind of stretch, knowing that, and spending the whole race knowing that it's going to come down to the end and that you're going to have that level of Josef Newgarden kind of attacking you through the end, and probably an acceptance that there was going to be, a couple of other cars there at the end as well, which turned out to be the case. It's just so much more than saving fuel. I think it's so important to recognise all of the other aspects of it. And his Toronto win a couple of years ago was a good example of that, where he had like no tyres left, and you could see the car moving around over the last few laps, and it just was not giving him anything back. But he's still able just to eke these wins out. I think it's so important not just kind of talk about this Scott Dixon fuel cheat code, that there's so many other aspects to it as well.
Yeah, and I just want to take a moment to celebrate some of those things, basically, because I found myself thinking about it while I was watching the race, and there are things that you notice when you're driving around Scott Dixon, out on track. Like, I've been around him even at Indy a few times. Like, I can remember the first stint at Indianapolis. I think unfortunately it was the year that he got in that huge accident. Like, it was 2017 maybe, but he was on pole. He'd stuck it on pole pretty handily. Like, he was like 232s for all 4 laps or something. Like, it was, I find when I'm watching Scott Dixon's qualifying runs at Indianapolis, I just, for some reason, he's the only one that I think about this like this, but I'm just imagining like a bigger engine in his car while I'm watching like, it's like a funny visualization that I have when I'm watching Scott go around. Like, it's just like somehow the sound of the air that the thing is pushing going down the front straightaway just seems louder to me or something. But it's just the mind F that, like, Scott Dixon in a Ganassi car in whole trim at Indianapolis gives, competitors, I guess. But that he went out there and, they did what I feel like they often do, which was, he was on pole. They also had him like super free and like trimmed out from the very beginning of the race, which is, reasonable enough strategy if you think you're going to be in clean air and whatever else, but it was obviously too much. And he's like, I don't know, with 10 to go in the stint or something, he just started like going backwards through the field. And I was running 5th or 6th or something. And, he's just walking back to me and just like hanging on for anybody else. Scott Dixon's heart rate was probably like 90 beats a minute driving this thing. For anybody else, just hanging on for dear life. Like, the thing is literally, he turned into turn 4. I caught him down the back straight, followed him through 3. I'm like off the gas halfway through 3 because he's just at partial throttle, like probably the entire way around the track, basically he's trying to hang on to this thing. Turns into turn 4, has this huge wiggle, walks it up the track, like can't even get the thing pointed to the left, basically, without the rear end starting to come around. So I ended up next to him in the middle of the corner just because I didn't really know where to go. Like, I didn't know. It was like, this is all just to get across like how completely jacked his whole situation was. He managed to hang on to it for another like 10 laps and pitted and put tires on and probably added a little rear wing or whatever and went back out and, just kept doing his thing. Like, there are these moments that you have driving around the guy that you're just thinking like, how have you not just crashed already, let alone you're still managing to hang into the top 10 with this thing that basically 90% of the rest of the field would have, 100% of the rest of the field would have at least pitted by now. And 90% of those would have already crashed, basically. But that in these particular situations, I think it's worth pointing out that it's this really rare and unique combination of total awareness for what's going on that's relevant to him. So he knows enough about the strategy. He knows enough just intuitively about like what he has to do with the car to be playing the long game, like stint by stint, basically. So to your point, he's in the final stint. He knows that he's made his final pit stop. He knows that he's got to get to the end. So I think in a way, my perception of this at least is he has just a natural knack for knowing how to get to the end and like knowing that that's ultimately like what he has to do. Like if it gets to and this, I think that was why I brought up the first stint at Indy thing is like he can manage to bring his energy level, I think, down a little bit by just knowing that there's this end game that he has to reach, like that's the thing that's going to go on here. But then having this whole other mental ability, which is, and I've heard this from people that have worked with Scott, that he's just one of these, there's a lot of drivers, a lot of great drivers that, whether it's meditation or it's some stretching thing or it's whatever, like they got to be like really in the zone. They got to like find their thing. And when they're in their thing, then when they're in in this headspace that they tinker with and kind of work towards and whatever, that's when they go do their best work. Everybody that I've ever talked to with the South that has worked with Scott is like he's like Ricky Bobby, like he wakes up in the morning and pisses excellence, like that he just gets in the car and goes like there's no none of this stuff. Like this is just what this guy does, and he doesn't even have to think about it, And so I guess the part of that I think is interesting is I do think that he has just this very innate knack for really feeling what the car is doing in the moment and being able to like the thing that really does separate the absolute most elite guys in any motorsport from the guys that are just a notch below that are probably also race winners and championship winners in the right context and whatever else. Like it's not just like we're talking like the most minimal of differences, but the thing that really separates guys like Scott and gives and enables them to win races like this is like that fraction of a percentage extra that they can maintain speed through the corner, get to throttle a tiny bit earlier, whatever, without overstressing the tire, basically. That they manage to just feel right where the thing is at the limit and not push it over that like 0.5% that ends up biting you in the ass, either by the time you get to the end of the race, like the tires are just too worn out, or that one time that the guy is right on you out of the hairpin and you try a little too hard to put the power down a little too early because you've gotten kind of like anxious about it or something. And he ends up sticking with you out of the corner so that there's nothing that you can do about it, basically, to defend. And I think that's the thing. We've talked about that a little bit with Scott. I think we talked about this when he won at the Indy GP or the Indy road course race later in the year last year. But like as a driver, watching somebody do that, and it's so disheartening when you're in Newgarden's position or Herta's position, you've got an advantage on this dude, but he's just doing that one little thing so well that you're like, fuck. Like I actually don't have the advantage that I thought I was going to have here because he's in clean air. He's got enough tire underneath him because he's managed this whole thing well enough. He's driving perfectly. Like maybe as perfectly or more perfectly than I could be doing this right now. And then to your point, you've got the Scott Dixon 4D chess on top of that, which is, well, he just knows in his head. Like it's probably why Scott Dixon's going to smoke everybody on a bunch of these like hybrid races whenever we get to that point, because he's thinking, all right, well, I use 2 seconds of push to pass out of the corner. I'm burning a lot of extra fuel doing that, but I'm creating that separation out of the corner. So Newgarden or Herta or whatever doesn't have like a big draft on me right out of the corner. I'm more trimmed than them. So I'm going to maintain that advantage, even if they're on push to pass a lot longer than would be normal. Then guess what? They're still 10 car lengths back by the time I get to the braking zone. So screw it. I'll lift and coast early because they're not even in there at this point. I've detached myself from them even considering making a move on me into turn one. Like they're resigned to the fact that like that's just not going to happen on this lap. They're probably already out of push to pass because they're just like, oh, well, I got to try again, next time around or whatever. And so you get this just cyclical thing of him being half a step ahead, basically, which is, I guess I don't want to spend too much more time on it, but like, it's all of those little things that add up, and that at least everybody else who's out there with him and watching that closely is just like, God damn, like he's, when is this going to stop? Like, when are we going to get to the point that we don't have to do this anymore against this guy?
Well, that's the other element of it, is the level of consistency in which he does it. When he's put in these situations, it's just so rare that he doesn't win the race. Or, when was the last time he made an error in one of those situations? Like, I mean, my memory's not the best in the world, but I can't think of a single time where that's happened, where he's been in that
Very
position
rare,
and has made some
yeah.
sort of critical error. So, yeah, it's one thing trying to compete with that on a one-off basis, but when it happens again and again, makes it even more difficult. From someone who's got the most experience in the IndyCar field to the person with the least, Theo Pourchaire made his debut at Long Beach over the weekend, having not even driven the car in any sort of test or anything. The first practice was his first time driving the car for Arrow McLaren in place of the still injured David Malukas. It was a pretty perfect performance, I think, in terms of a person who hasn't driven an IndyCar before. Maybe the one area of criticism would be that he didn't quite put his final qualifying lap together when obviously the track's evolving all the time. You almost always, your last lap's going to be your best, and it didn't quite come together for him. He started 22nd, but in the race he was really cool, calm and composed. Stayed out on that first stop. We talked about Scott Dixon and Will Power coming into the pits for that one. Pourchaire committed with some other guys there, jumped up to 8th place. Once all the strategies had played out kind of at the end, he'd come out in 18th, and with Alexander Rossi in front of him, worked his way all the way up to 11th, which was super impressive. I think it's probably worth pointing out that the only person who was on exactly the same strategy as Pourchaire from that group in front of him was Rinus VeeKay, and he'd pitted earlier on both of his previous pit stops. So it's not like Theo Pourchaire was like some sort of in some sort of video game just driving around these guys. There was a bit of strategy difference, but to put himself in that position in the first place was really impressive. There was also some other kind of under the radar elements to his race that were really impressive. What did he do? He set the 8th best race lap overall of anyone, and obviously we had some fuel saving going on, and fastest laps in IndyCar aren't quite as important as they maybe are in some other motorsport series, but still impressive that he just had that pace in the tank. He set a quicker lap than Alexander Rossi in front of him as well. He did the 6th best in lap and the 14th best out lap as well, and when you consider his kind of lack of experience on cold tyres and a heavy IndyCar as well, that's super impressive. Just the way he approached everything, and the way he just kind of turned up and got in the car in a quite low-key kind of, I'm just going to turn up and do my job kind of way was really impressive. And to deliver that result kind of on pace with Rossi for the majority of the race. I think Rossi probably had a little bit of damage from his early shunt with Pato O'Ward, who went into the back of him. Pretty bad weekend for McLaren in that sense, but a really good recovery from Rossi to 10th and Pourchaire to 11th. Was there anything about Pourchaire's performance that stood out to you, JR, that really impressed you?
No, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head for me, which was basically, just saying it another way. He clearly had the bandwidth basically to just show up and take in a bunch of difficult things and basically manage it all in stride. Basically, he seemed like somebody, he at bare minimum seemed like somebody who had done this before, in terms of, I mean, I think the way that he got through the weekend to me was less like seeing somebody who's never driven an IndyCar but's really good, and more like somebody who has a lot of experience already doing this and got it. So I think if you match up the fact that he's also clearly really good and just could kind of whatever, like once he actually gets a little bit more used to it, you can expect all of those, sort of results-based stats probably to improve, because he'd just be more in tune with what's going on. That I think is the most impressive thing to me, and speaks to unquestionably just his skill level and kind of probably skill level jumping in anything. I mean, that's as a fan, that's what I like to look for is, are these guys that have seemingly just done kind of this one thing in this one way for a long time, how easily do they adapt to doing something different? And what does that kind of tell us about how they could do in maybe various different things or different kinds of scenarios? So you got to think McLaren was super impressed having him there, because they can see the same thing that we see very loosely in much more detail, inside, which is probably wasn't much that needed to change for him to be, not even for him to have qualified in the top 12. There probably wasn't much, honestly, for him to have qualified in the top 12. His laps had been different and kind of whatever, the way that he was trending, and then it just like didn't come together when it mattered. But certainly to have been higher up than where he was, he through his pace in practice was indicating that he was figuring that out quickly enough to be in a half a bracket further up the field, just on outright pace, even just at that point in the weekend. I thought, like you said, to have just not put a wheel wrong, to have seemed like he was very much in control and, not in control of the car, but just like in control kind of mentally, emotionally, understanding the way the race was working. McLaren absolutely, I'm always a fan in these kinds of situations when you've got a new guy, just put him on whatever the strategy is going to be that lets him just go flat out, not have to save fuel and do all that stuff. Not that he couldn't have done that, but certainly makes it easier on them when you can just give them as much time as they can take to kind of like go hard and see what they can make of that. So yeah, I was definitely impressed. He seemed, I didn't bump into him at any point, but just from kind of what you saw over the course of the weekend, he seemed relaxed, more or less about the whole situation. So it's definitely the right attitude. It's the kind of attitude you see that in somebody and you think like, okay, this isn't the last we've seen of this dude for sure.
Yeah, it's funny to think about it from a kind of zoomed out perspective that this could actually work against McLaren, because they've kind of given him this big headline debut where he's impressed a load of people, and then if they haven't got a ride for him next year, then they might lose him to another team. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out now and how he gets on at Barber. He will be in the car at Barber, that's been confirmed now. He expected that to be the case and kind of accidentally let it slip in the kind of pre-weekend press conference that he would be doing 2 races, and then kind of walked that back and was like, well, the second race depends whether David's fit or not, but I'm probably going to be doing both the races, and that's what's ended up happening. So he'll be back out again. We had some kind of talk about David Malukas over the weekend as well from various different people. There was a media session with Zach Brown and Gavin Ward where Malukas' kind of future was discussed. I'd seen it reported in some places that they'd kind of inferred that they could be thinking about moving on without David, or that could be a potential option. From the transcript I saw, I didn't think that's what they said, although they were obviously talking about having to come up with lots of different options, basically. I did speak to Tony Kanaan 24 hours or so ago, which is irrelevant to you when you listen to this podcast because you don't know when I'm recording, so that's fun. But he basically said that he expected David to be in the car at the 500. So that's an interesting kind of timeline update from my perspective anyway, in terms of how I think about it. It's obviously a very moving target with his recovery. It's already delayed, could be delayed further, and we don't really have a specific date to kind of look towards, or a specific event at the moment either to look towards for David's return. So for Tony to say that he expects it to be the 500, although he's obviously not guaranteeing that that's going to be the case, but that's what they're kind of working towards. That was interesting for me, although I do understand that Callum Ilott has been kind of lined up for the 500 to take over that car if it's needed and David isn't fit. I think there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes there as well, especially with Tony. He's been taking him to all his appointments and stuff, and he reckons he's been spending like 70% of his time on David, which is like almost at the detriment of Pato and Alexander, who Tony was kind of employed to obviously work with them as well and try to help improve their performance as well. So that's been a big part of it. And I thought it was quite sweet. Tony's put one of his sims in his in David's house so that David's ready to get back on a sim again once his hand's ready. So there's no shortage of kind of effort going in from Tony, especially there, and it'll be interesting to see how that story kind of plays out in the next few weeks. But I think Barber JR is going to be, well, I don't know if I'm now taking Long Beach and kind of extrapolating that out in a unfair way, but it's much more like some of the European kind of road courses that Theo would have grown up on. So I'm kind of expecting big things now after his 11th at Long Beach. So I don't know, is that fair? Do you think, based on kind of what he's done before, that's, you know, a nice opportunity for him to go in there?
I would think so. I mean, there's been a lot of European, or guys that have come from European racing backgrounds that have shown up and tested at Barber, at least, that have always been like pretty quick right away, in my experience with it, at least.
Palou had his first win there.
Yeah, I mean, I think just it's certainly more natural for these guys. It doesn't take away the fact that there's a bunch of active IndyCar guys that are really good there and have a lot of experience. So, you know, he's still going to have to, if he's going to get inside the top 10, he's still going to have to do something really impressive. You know, he's going to have to be better than a bunch of guys that are really good and have been there before and are in good equipment. So I think that part of it doesn't really change, but just in terms of familiarity, I would think that it's certainly more familiar than showing up at Long Beach, of all places. We talked about that ahead of this event, that it's like Long Beach is among, I think, the tougher places to have to just show up and figure out. I mean, any of the street circuits basically are probably all in kind of a similar category from that point of view. Yeah. But I mean, I think it's probably fair. It's, I don't know if expectation is the right word to use, but fair to kind of make the assumption that he'll be, you know, even better here, at least in terms of extracting pace and kind of however that ends up factoring into the overall equation, results wise over the course of a weekend.
I guess the one thing to consider against my expectation then is that the Barber is one of the tracks that is kind of most tested on by IndyCar teams and drivers. So in terms of like, it might suit him better, but he's going up against, you know, a lot of drivers who will have done so many laps around Barber that, you know, that's an even bigger kind of hill to climb for him to adapt. So that'll be interesting to watch. I just want to jump back to Long Beach quickly before we finish up the whole Josef Newgarden, Colton Herta situation. This was kind of rare one where I thought it kind of played out in terms of what the drivers said. I kind of agreed with basically both of their takes on the incident. The one thing I didn't really agree with was how it was officiated. So I'll be interested to get your thoughts on that. But just to kind of recap the incident in case anyone didn't see it, Josef Newgarden was attacking Scott Dixon for the win, got a little bit checked up at the last hairpin, and Colton went into the back of him, and Colton admitted to misjudging it. He hit him and kind of lifted him up, and when that happens in IndyCar, when the rear wheels go up into the air, sometimes they can hit anti-stall and basically just bog Josef down, and he lost the place. So we've got, I mean, this is after the fact, but we've got Colton kind of admitting that he'd done something wrong and that he was, you know, he was accepting of that. He said he thought a drive-through would have been harsh, but he was surprised that he wasn't asked to like drop back or basically give the place back. And Josef, and I think I heard it reported secondhand from the TV at least, that either Tim Cindric or the Penske box, let's say, were not happy with how that was called either. What was your take on the officiating there? Would you have expected for Colton to, you know, having given that back, or is there some element of that these guys are fighting for the win at the end of a race here that IndyCar is trying to let go or something? I'm at least personally for me, I'm at a loss to work out how this has kind of been ruled.
Yeah, I think that there's a little lack of we're lacking in transparency here in terms of how these calls are made, which I don't love personally. Like, to me, the order or the magnitude of the incident compared to Pato into the back of Rossi is different for sure. You know, like Pato obviously, you know, just piled into the back of Alexander. Like, it was much more apparent that there was a misjudgment there and that it was avoidable and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. But it was basically the same incident. Like, it was the same thing roughly that happened. So really just like if the penalty for Pato had not been so harsh, like, I guess I'd be okay with kind of how this ended up transpiring between Josef and Colton. But it just seemed like a weird mismatch of kind of having a similar incident in the same race, establishing a precedent for, okay, this wasn't actually an incident that completely ruined either of these guys' race. Like it wasn't. So I think the other thing that we kind of can get into the weeds here with is, does the punishment match the crime in terms of like the outcome, or is just avoidable contact? I feel like IndyCar kind of has been like all over the place on all of this, but narrowing that down a little bit, I think would help to at least understand the way that these calls are made. Like, okay, like I'd probably be okay with saying, all right, the same thing happens in two different situations, but the outcomes in terms of how much somebody got hosed by it are different. And so that's going to slightly affect the magnitude of the penalty, I guess. But even if we were going to take that stance, if the first incident is a drive-through, then the second incident is at bare minimum give up a couple of spots. And the middle ground here, which I feel like we just don't do at all, is like 5 or 10 second time penalties or something that seem like a potentially obvious way to address these types of in-between scenarios. Like, okay, you kind of still leave it up to these guys. Maybe that just creates more incentive for Colton to get around Scott. And so because he's got to put 5 seconds on Newgarden or whoever to kind of like figure out where they're going to stack up at the end of the race or whatever. But, and I, it's like I can understand in a different sense why race control or IndyCar's race control doesn't love that kind of stuff, because then you end up in situations like you do with F1 where you have this kind of confusing, like the order that guys go across the finish line is different from where they actually end up on the timesheet or whatever. But ultimately the outcome here was, to me, just if you just took the final thing in isolation and that was the only incident like that happened during the race, you kind of have to just like shrug your shoulders and say, okay, well, that seemed like Josef got screwed, and so there should be some kind of penalty associated with that. But maybe, to your point, race control is just trying to be as hands off as possible at these kinds of things. But they had something very similar happen earlier in the race that seemed like enough of a similar situation to me to say, all right, well, shouldn't there be something that happens here? If, just because it wasn't quite as bad and there wasn't like parts flying all over the place, we're just not going to do anything. The other thing that I'm just going to flag, because I think it's like we all complain about this all the time, and it seems like a super obvious thing to change in the rules, is like Kiffin Simpson was sitting there as a lapped car among this group of the top 5 for the entire last part of the race, just blocking guys that are not Ganassi cars. And no command blues. It's like, yo, we're in the last stint. Like, get lapped cars the hell out of the way if they're among the lead. And not that I think that had a huge impact on any of this, but it was another thing. I was watching the final couple of laps of the guys going on the front straight. It's like, what is that? Who is in front of Josef? Like, did Josef get passed by another car? It was like, oh no, it's Kiffin Simpson a lap down. Like, what? Like, why? That's actually and I say all that because we like the fact that in contrast to F1, IndyCar allows everybody to race much deeper into the race. But by the time you get to the point that everybody's made their final pit stops, all anybody cares about, particularly fans, in my opinion, is what's actually happening among guys for position. And you want to see them race as much as they could possibly race until the end. And so that's why, to me, like, this whole lapped car in the last segment of the race thing just at some point here needs to get addressed.
Yeah, totally agree. I think just generally a bit more transparency would be fantastic. And I think we're spoilt on the F1 side because there's a steward's document for everything that happens, basically, from like literally anything over the course of a weekend that is assessed or looked at by race control or the stewards is kind of documented in some way, shape or form, whether it goes straight to the broadcast team or whether it's in paper form online. So I think the resource element of that is quite a significant thing. And you mentioned, like, even with like timing and scoring, sometimes it's difficult to have like a car get a 5-second penalty and then it finished a race somewhere, and all of these kind of things. There's a resource kind of aspect to it. There's not 5,000 people officiating these races either, but I do think there's a probably a better happy medium there where, I mean, I'm sure it'd be nice for the drivers to have a better idea sometimes of just how things are policed, but for fans as well to understand what they're watching, to understand the racing. And I think this comes back to something that Zach Brown had talked about a little bit in his kind of media roundtable over the course of the weekend, where he was talking about the kind of TV coverage and how it explains things to casual fans as well as, you know, kind of in-depth fans. And he used the example of the alternate tires, which is, you know, one I repeatedly talk about again and again and again, because I sometimes still get them too mixed up, and just think soft and hard is much easier and simpler and better way to describe those tires to someone who doesn't know IndyCar racing.
And it's accurate.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Like, it's not like we're making something up.
No, exactly. You know. And you know, someone who has watched an F1 race before and then turns on IndyCar and hears all this talk about moving from the primary to the alternates, and like that just doesn't, you know.
Sometimes they're red and sometimes they're green. And
yeah, exactly. It's not.
It is hard to follow.
It doesn't resonate, and I think there's other aspects that I would group into that, and I think the way things are policed sometimes I would fall into that, because I don't think we're always kind of in the know as to what's happened or how it's been judged. So that'd be an interesting thing to move forward, and I'm sure we can ask IndyCar about that in the coming weeks and months as well. This week is the debut, I can say debut of season 2 of 100 Days to Indy on Friday if you're in the States. You can watch it, but you will have to see me if you do watch it. So apologies for that in advance, but just wanted to alert you to the fact that season 2 is out. Some really cool people in it alongside me. Looking forward. I haven't actually watched it myself yet, so I'm looking forward to seeing that, and probably quite terrified.
Are you like sit down interview style in it?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Jack.
Yeah.
Superstar.
In Long Beach and in a very weird warehouse in London as well.
Nice.
But probably the less said about that, the better. At least a little bit of insight anyway. So yeah, we'll be back with another episode of the Race IndyCar podcast next week after IndyCar is raced at Barber. So we'll speak to you then.
The Athletic.